Today, we will discuss the first component of macroeconomics, which is GDP now. What is GDP, gross domestic product? GDP is a key indicator in macroeconomics that measures the total value of all goods and services produced within a country's borders during a specific time period, usually annually or quarterly. It provides a comprehensive snapshot of a nation's economic activity and health. Key aspects of GDP. Components. GDP is typically calculated using three main approaches. Production approach, summing the value added at each stage of production. Expenditure approach, calculating the total spending on the nation's final goods and services, represented by the formula GDPA plus I plus G plus XM, where C equals consumption, I equals investment, G equals government spending, X equals exports, M equals imports income approach, summing the total income earned by factors of production, including wages, rents, interests, and profits. Types: nominal GDP, measured at current market prices without inflation adjustment. Real GDP, adjusted for inflation, reflecting the true value of goods and services. GDP per capita, GDP divided by the population, indicating the average economic output per person. Relationship between GDP and macroeconomics. Economic health. GDP serves as a primary measure of economic health. Higher GDP typically indicates a growing economy, while declining GDP may signal a recession. Policy decisions. Macroeconomic policies, including fiscal policy, government spending and taxation, and monetary policy, central bank actions regarding money supply and interest rates, are often guided by GDP trends to promote economic stability and growth. Comparative analysis. GDP allows for comparisons between different economies or over time, helping economists and policymakers understand economic performance and inform strategies. Indicators of well-being. While GDP is a valuable economic measure, it does not account for income distribution, environmental sustainability, or quality of life indicators, which are also critical aspects of macroeconomic analysis. Classical economists' support for GDP. Classical economists view GDP as an essential tool for assessing economic output and growth. They emphasize the importance of production and income generation within the economy. Focus on long-term growth. They believe that improving GDP over time reflects a nation's ability to produce more and improve living standards. Keynesian economists. Emphasis on demand. Keynesians focus on the role of aggregate demand in driving economic activity. They consider GDP an important indicator of economic health, particularly during recessions, when demand is low. Policy implications. They argue that governmental intervention can stimulate demand and boost GDP, highlighting the need for active fiscal policies in managing the economy. Marxist economists. Critique of GDP. Marxist economists criticize GDP for failing to capture the social and economic inequalities generated by capitalism. They argue that GDP overlooks the distribution of wealth and the exploitation of labor. Focus on surplus value. They emphasize the importance of understanding the production process and the conflicting interests of capitalists and workers, rather than simply measuring output. Post-Keynesian economists. Skepticism of GDP. Post-Keynesians often argue that GDP is insufficient for understanding economic well-being. They express concerns about its inability to reflect the complexities of economic structures and behaviors. Human and environmental factors. They advocate for incorporating social and environmental elements into economic assessments, promoting measures that consider well-being rather than just output. Development economists beyond GDP. Development economists advocate for alternative measures of progress, such as the Human Development Index, HDI, which considers health, education, and income. Focus on equity and poverty. They argue that GDP growth does not necessarily translate to improvements in living standards for all segments of society, especially in developing nations. Environmental economists' sustainability concerns. Environmental economists highlight the limitations of GDP in measuring environmental degradation and resource depletion. They argue that continuous economic growth as indicated by GDP may not be sustainable. Green GDP. They propose adjustments to GDP calculations to account for environmental costs, advocating for measures that reflect sustainable development practices. Behavioral economists. Human happiness and well-being. Behavioral economists argue that GDP is not a sufficient indicator of happiness or well-being. They suggest that factors such as social bonds, mental health, and work-life balance are also critical to assessing economic prosperity. Various economic theories provide different frameworks for understanding and interpreting gross domestic product, GDP. Here are some of the most prominent economic theories and their perspectives on GDP. Classical economics theory. Overview. Classical economics, founded by economists such as Adam Smith and David Ricardo, emphasizes the self-regulating nature of markets and the role of supply in determining output. Perspective on GDP. Classical economists view GDP as an important measure of a nation's economic activity. They argue that long-term growth in GDP reflects increases in productivity and efficient resource allocation, driven by free markets. Keynesian economics theory. Overview. Developed by John Maynard Keynes during the Great Depression, this theory emphasizes the importance of aggregate demand in driving economic output. Perspective on GDP. Keynesians argue that fluctuations in GDP are primarily the result of changes in consumer and business spending. They advocate for government intervention through fiscal policy to stabilize the economy and boost aggregate demand, especially during recessions. New Keynesian economics theory overview. This branch of Keynesian economics incorporates microeconomic foundations to explain price rigidities and imperfect competition. Perspective on GDP. New Keynesians contend that nominal rigidities can lead to prolonged periods of unemployment and underutilization of resources, influencing GDP. They support active monetary and fiscal policies to manage demand and stabilize the economy. Monetarism theory overview. Associated with Milton Friedman, monetarism focuses on the role of money supply in influencing economic activity. Perspective on GDP. Monetarists maintain that controlling the money supply is crucial for managing inflation, and consequently economic growth is measured by GDP. They argue that changes in the money supply can have significant short-term impacts on GDP by influencing investment and consumer spending. Supply-side economics theory. Overview. Supply-side economics emphasizes the role of producers in the economy, suggesting that lower taxes and decreased regulation spur economic growth. Perspective on GDP. Proponents believe that by creating a favorable environment for businesses, GDP can grow through increased investment and productivity. They argue that GDP growth can be achieved by encouraging supply-side factors rather than focusing solely on demand. Neoclassical economics theory. Overview. Building on classical theories, neoclassical economics incorporates elements of marginalism and utility maximization. Perspective on GDP. Neoclassical theorists focus on individual behavior and the importance of supply and demand in determining output levels. They believe GDP is influenced by factors such as technology, labor, and capital accumulation. 6. New classical economics theory. Overview. Emerging in the late 20th century, new classical economics emphasizes rational expectations and market-clearing mechanisms. Perspective on GDP. New classical economists argue that GDP fluctuations are primarily short-term and that markets tend to adjust efficiently to new information. They often downplay the role of government intervention in stabilizing the economy. Section 9. Limitations of GDP. While GDP is a crucial economic indicator, it has limitations. It doesn't account for income inequality, environmental degradation, or the value of non-market activities like household production and volunteer work. GDP also fails to capture the well-being of a population, which includes factors like health, education, and social connections. Furthermore, GDP can be influenced by factors that don't necessarily reflect genuine economic progress, such as increased spending on healthcare due to an aging population, or on disaster relief after a natural disaster. This was all for today. Please like, subscribe, and leave comment in the comment section. Thanks for watching.